This is the Tri-State Time Machine. Each week, your host, Vanessa Hankins, and her guests share memories and stories about the past, the present, and the future of the Tri-State area. That's West Virginia, Kentucky, and the Ohio areas. If you used to live here, or you currently live here, you're going to catch yourself saying out loud, "Wow, I remember that." Now, here's Vanessa.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Tri-State Time Machine. This week's going to be a little different because it's just me. And honestly, sometimes I think these end up becoming some of my favorite episodes. Because I get to sit down, let my brain wander a little, and talk about things that have genuinely just been sitting with me for a while. And this topic, I've been thinking about it more than I probably realized. Kind of one of those living rent-free in the back of your mind. I started thinking recently about stories, not books necessarily, not movies, just stories. The stories our families passed down, the weird things your grandparents told you growing up that somehow became absolutely law in your household. And I hope you're thinking of a few off the top of your head, because even just saying that out loud, they start popping into my head. The strange little superstitions older generations believed so deeply that you eventually started believing them too, even though nobody could ever explain why. I mean, why? Why don't we have answers? Anyways, I started realizing something. If you grew up in Appalachia, especially if you grew up here in the tri-state, our communities are built on stories. Ghost stories, family stories, urban legends, local folklore, weird superstitions that nobody questions, creepy stories older cousins told us simply because apparently terrifying our younger family members was considered quality entertainment in the 90s. And if your childhood looked anything like mine, there was always, that one place. Every town had one. The road everybody swore was haunted. The abandoned building nobody wanted to drive past at night. The old house somebody claimed had a woman standing in the upstairs window. The cemetery everyone dared each other to visit. But while I was thinking of all this, I started realizing that stories do something much bigger than entertain us. Stories shape places. Stories shape identity. Stories shape how communities remember themselves. But stories also shape how other people see us. And I think Appalachia has spent a very long time having stories told about us by people who do not actually know us. And sometimes those stories become the only thing outsiders think that they know about places like West Virginia or communities like Huntington. So today, I kind of want to talk about both sides of that. The weird stories we grew up hearing, but also the bigger stories the world has told about communities like ours, which I know sounds a little deeper than my usual random historical rabbit holes, but just stay with me, because I think this one is going somewhere interesting, or I hope so. So, let's start with the weird stuff first. The Mothman. All right, I feel like if you're from West Virginia, there is absolutely no better place to begin than the fact that somehow one of the most famous things our state has ever produced is a giant flying creature with glowing red eyes, which honestly feels aggressively on brand for us. For anybody listening who somehow has never heard the story of Mothman, let me catch you up, okay? The story starts in November 1966 in Point Pleasant. And first of all, if you have never been to Point Pleasant, I highly recommend it, because I genuinely respect any town willing to fully embrace weirdness. But back in 1966, two young couples were driving around near what the locals had called the TNT area, which was an old World War II Mution site. I hope I'm saying that right. Basically abandoned after the war, so already creepy. Already not somewhere I personally want to be hanging out after dark. But according to the reports, while driving through the area, they spotted something standing near the road. And what they described was a massive gray creature, somewhere around 6 or 7 feet tall, huge wings that folded behind its back, and glowing bright red eyes. That part's important. Which, no, absolutely not. Immediate no. According to the story, they got in the car and sped off. But then the creature started following them, flying overhead, keeping pace with the vehicle, which I would personally describe as the end of my life. But here's where things become stranger. Over the next several months, dozens of people in Point Pleasant began reporting seeing the exact same creature. Same description, giant wings, tall figure, bright glowing red eyes, multiple sightings. And naturally, once people start reporting the same thing, rumors tend to spread. But here's where the story became part of history. About 13 months later, December of 1967, the Silver Bridge connecting Point Pleasant to Ohio collapsed. 40 people were killed. One of the worst bridge disasters in American history. And suddenly, people started connecting the sightings. People began believing that Mothman had somehow been a warning, like people had witnessed something supernatural before the tragedy struck. Now, personally, I have absolutely no idea what these people saw. Maybe mass hysteria? Maybe somebody saw a giant bird and suddenly everybody started seeing giant birds. Maybe something genuinely strange did happen. Who knows? But I think what fascinates me is what this says about Appalachia. We have always been communities that tell stories to explain things that we cannot explain. And sometimes those stories survive for generations. Also, somewhere in another state, there's probably a person who hears West Virginia and immediately thinks of a flying demon creature. Which feels unfair, but honestly, kind of hilarious. I own it. I love it. So, Appalachian superstitions. Let's go into that a little bit. Honestly, as weird as Mothman is, I think one of the strangest parts about growing up around here was probably realizing later in life just how many completely random things adults had convinced us that were factual. And I swear every grandmother in Appalachia somehow held 4 advanced degrees. Medicine, weather forecasting, spiritual protection, and death prediction. Heavy on that last one. But think about how many of these you heard growing up. Bird hits the window, somebody's going to die. Why? Nobody knows. But suddenly everybody in the house feels uncomfortable. Do not sweep over somebody's feet. Because now, apparently, they will never get married, which honestly feels a little unnecessarily harsh. Open an umbrella indoors, bad luck. Spill salt, better throw it over your shoulder. Ears ringing, somebody's talking about you. Palm itching, money's coming. And although I still have no idea which hand meant good money, I have heard 70 different versions of that one. And then, the one that absolutely terrified me as a child, if somebody dies in the house, cover the mirrors. Which, as a kid, nobody explains. They just quietly cover every mirror in the house. And now suddenly you're 8 years old wondering if spirits are trapped in the bathroom. But what makes Appalachian culture fascinating is where these beliefs actually come from. A lot of these traditions came from Irish settlers. Scottish traditions, religious beliefs, generational customs passed down over 100 years, which means, without realizing it, we inherited pieces of history through stories. Which also means half of us were raised somewhere between actual science and complete supernatural chaos. So, haunted places. And I know this next part's universal. Every town, every country, every community, everybody had that place. And what fascinates me now as an adult is realizing that nobody ever knew the entire story. But somehow, everyone agreed that it was terrifying. Growing up, every area had some abandoned place attached to rumors. Maybe an old school, maybe an abandoned hospital, maybe some creepy old house on a back road, maybe an old industrial building that everybody swore was haunted. And every older kid knew somebody whose cousin had definitely seen something there. But that's how all these stories always worked, you know? It was never firsthand. It was always, my friend's brother saw it. My cousin heard something there. Somebody saw lights in the windows. A woman in white appears after midnight. We all know those stories. And honestly, I really love that. Because long before the internet, communities entertained themselves by passing stories down and around. Local folklore existed long before social media, before podcasts, before documentaries. Communities preserve stories simply by talking to each other. And that feels kind of beautiful when you think about it. But while some stories stay local, some stories grow much bigger than that. Because while ghost stories are harmless, there are other stories people have been telling about Appalachia for a very long time. Stories about poverty, stories about intelligence, stories about addiction, stories about education, stories about culture. And I think, somewhere along the way, people stopped seeing Appalachia as a collection of deeply complex communities and started reducing it to stereotypes. And I want to talk about that next. So, before my little pause, I spent a lot of time talking about the stories we grew up hearing here. Ghost stories, family traditions, weird superstitions that nobody questions, the folklore passed down from generation to generation. And honestly, I think there's something beautiful about communities preserving stories like that. But while I was putting together this episode, I kept finding myself coming back to a bigger thought. Because stories do not just shape how communities see themselves. Stories shape how other people see communities as well. And I think if you're from Appalachia, whether that's West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, Southern Ohio, Tennessee, Virginia, anywhere in this region, you know exactly what I mean when I say people think that they know us, even when they have never stepped foot here, even when they've never lived here, even when everything they think they know came from television, movies, political conversations, documentaries, or headlines. And I started asking myself something while researching all of this. When exactly did Appalachia become a stereotype? Because somewhere along the way, this entire region got turned into a character. Hardship is real in Appalachia, but it became the only story. So before I go any further, I want to say something very clearly. Appalachia has struggled. economic decline, coal industry collapse, generational poverty in some communities, limited job opportunities, addiction, underfunded education systems, lack of investment. Those things are real. And I'm not pretending that these things do not exist, because they do. But I think the problem starts when hardship becomes the only story that people tell about a place. Because eventually, people stop seeing human beings. They stop seeing families. They stop seeing culture. They stop seeing history. They stop seeing complexity. And instead, they begin seeing characters. So let's talk about the stereotypes that we all know. And if you grew up anywhere around here, I think we all know the stereotypes. Tell somebody out west you're from West Virginia, and suddenly the jokes start. Missing teeth jokes, incest jokes, education jokes, poverty jokes, the barefoot hillbilly stereotype. And I think what is strange to me is that people say these things so casually. Like somehow entire communities are becoming the punchline. And it's completely normal. But stereotypes do not appear out of nowhere. Somewhere, those ideas had to be built into American culture. I think, in my opinion, that Hollywood helped build this narrative. And one thing I found fascinating while researching was realizing just how much film and television shaped public perception of Appalachia. One of the biggest examples of that is the 1972 film Deliverance. If you know, you know. Cue the banjos. Now, if somehow you've never seen Deliverance, first of all, congratulations. Because I genuinely wish I could say the same. Because that movie is deeply unsettling. But the basic story follows 4 men from Atlanta who go on this canoe trip in rural Georgia. And during the trip, they encounter an isolated, like, mountain men type situation who are portrayed as violent, dangerous, uneducated, brutal, primitive. And while technically the story takes place in Georgia, the cultural impact spread everywhere. Because suddenly, mountain people became a horror trope. And I do not think people fully understand how deeply that film shaped public perception. Entire generations of Americans grew up seeing depictions of Appalachian communities as backwards, dangerous, isolated, uncivilized. And movies have power. Once people see the same narrative enough time, they start assuming the narrative reflects reality. Imagine living in a region where millions of people who have never met you have already decided what kind of person you are because of a movie. So a little personal reflection. And I think what bothers me about that, the whole thing of all these people that have never met us have already decided who we are, is that people forget that this region, or what this region actually helped build. Appalachia is not some isolated footnote in American history. These communities were built by miners, railroad workers, factory workers, farmers, teachers, generations of people doing physically brutal work, just trying to build stable lives for their families. But somehow, all of that gets erased. And instead, people hear Appalachia and immediately picture barefoot hillbillies sitting on porches playing banjos. Which, first of all, I would like to publicly defend banjos, because banjos are fantastic. Seriously, like, if you don't love a banjo, whatever. Have your opinion, but they're great. But seriously, imagine your entire region just becoming a punchline. So I've tried to wrap my head around why the world loves Appalachian struggle. And another thing that I kept noticing while researching all of this is how often the rest of the country seems interested in Appalachia. Only when suffering is involved, though. And honestly, I find that incredibly frustrating because it feels like outsiders become interested in places like ours only when tragedy is attached. Think about documentaries. Think about national media coverage. Think about political conversations. How often do you see stories celebrating Appalachian innovation? Appalachian art? Appalachian architecture? Appalachian music? Appalachian resilience? Appalachian creativity? Appalachian culture? Honestly, not very often. But the second that there is poverty, addiction, unemployment, disaster, suddenly cameras show up. Another interesting example of this conversation is about hillbilly elegy. And listen, I know people have very mixed opinions about this book. And I'm not really here to debate whether people love it or hate it. But I do think the bigger conversation surrounding it matters, because for many outsiders, books like that become confirmation. They read one story and suddenly believe that they understand an entire region. And I think that that's dangerous, because no place should ever be reduced to one narrative. No community is one thing, no city is one thing, no region is one thing. So reflect on that. And I think maybe that is what bothers me the most. Not that people acknowledge hardship. Hardships absolutely deserve discussion. Poverty should be discussed. Addiction should be discussed. Economic struggle should be discussed. But struggle cannot become the entire identity for people to assign to a place. Because when that happens, people stop seeing humanity. And they stop believing communities are capable of becoming anything different. And honestly, I do not think that I've had that happen anywhere more personally than right here in Huntington. So throughout this episode, I've spent a lot of time talking about stories. Stories families tell, the folklore that communities preserve, the stereotypes attached to Appalachia, the way entire regions slowly become a character over time. But I think if I'm going to talk about this honestly, I have to bring this conversation closer to home. Because I do not think that there is a city in our immediate area that understands this conversation better than Huntington. And I think sometimes when you live somewhere your entire life, you forget that people outside of your city often see a completely different version of the place than you do. And I think Huntington may be one of the clearest examples of that. I think when most people listening know exactly what I mean when I say, there was a period where it felt like every single time Huntington made national news, it was bad. And I think one of the biggest shifts happened right when the opioid epidemic became impossible to ignore. Because suddenly, Huntington, it became one of the places that national media repeatedly returned to when they wanted to talk about addiction in America. And I want to say this very clearly. Addiction, it's real. Families here have suffered tremendously, my family included. Lives have been lost. Entire generations have been affected. I know families personally who have experienced that pain. I know my family has personally experienced it. Most people listening right now probably know somebody too. And I'm not minimizing that. I'm not pretending that it didn't happen. I'm not pretending that communities here did not suffer. But I remember watching national coverage over the years and thinking something over and over again. This is not the whole story. So because every documentary, every national news segment, every major headline seemed to focus on one thing, the worst thing happening here. And I understand why. Addiction's serious. Communities needed help. Resources needed attention. Conversations needed to happen. I am not arguing against any of that. But imagine living in a place where every single time outsiders hear your city mentioned, it's connected to tragedy. Imagine watching people around the country build their entire perception of your hometown based entirely on pain. Imagine realizing people have already decided that your community is broken before they know anything else about it. Here's some things that people outside of Huntington never see. And I think this part is another bit that frustrates me the most. Because if all of you know about Huntington comes from headlines, then you don't know Huntington at all. What people outside this community do not see is connection. They do not see how deeply people here care about one another. They do not see the neighbors stepping in when families struggle. They do not see the local organizations doing impossible work with limited resources. They do not see community members constantly trying to make this place better. They do not see how unbelievably hard people here fight for one another. I think about places like the Keith Albee Performing Arts Center. And I think that building alone tells a completely different story about Huntington than national media could ever. Here you have this absolutely beautiful historic theater sitting in the middle of downtown, right here on 4th Avenue. I'm literally recording in my office inside the Keith Albee right now. Built in 1928, one of the last fully intact atmospheric theaters still standing in America. A building representing history, art, preservation, architecture, community investment. And I think about how easy it would have been for somebody outside the city to never know places like this even exist here, because nobody is putting that on national television. I think a lot about Marshall University too. And no, I do not just mean football. Although, let's be honest, football is basically a religion around here. But Marshall represents something bigger. Education, innovation, young people building futures, medical advancement, economic development, community identity. But somehow, those stories never feel loud enough compared to the headlines. And as locals, we know what headlines it are that keep the people coming back. It's not the good stuff. And maybe this is what I appreciate most about communities like Huntington. We are resilient in ways that people from outside places like this often do not understand, because smaller communities have no choice but to rely on each other. I think people here know how to survive hard seasons. We know how to rebuild. We know how to adapt. We know how to take care of each other. I think communities that have experienced struggle often develop a kind of empathy that you really do not find anywhere else. Because when communities hurts together, people learn how to carry one another. But I want to be careful here, because I do not want this episode to sound like I'm pretending that Huntington does not have problems. We do. Poverty exists here, addiction exists here, crime exists here, economic struggle exists here. There are families hurting every single day. There are neighborhoods still fighting to recover. Hell, if you've been paying attention to headlines, we have communities surrounding us that don't even have drinkable water. I know that. Everybody listening knows that. But I think where I struggle is watching outsiders behave as though struggle is all that we are. Because communities should never be defined solely on the hardest thing that they've gone through. I think that every place has a difficult chapter. Or difficult chapters. It may not even just one. Every city, every community, every family even. But imagine if somebody met you and decided your entire identity once felt completely different. Stories preserve memory. And without stories, places disappear long before the buildings do. And honestly, I think this is why I have always cared so deeply about local history. This history, it's not just presidents, it's not just wars, it's not just dates written inside textbooks. History is communities. History is families. History is neighborhoods. History is traditions. History is ordinary people quietly building lives. History is local restaurants people will still miss 20 years later. History is movie theaters that shaped our childhood memories. History is family businesses. History is grandparents telling stories for younger generations. That way, they're not forgotten. And they love when you ask about them. And I think sometimes people forget preserving history is really just preserving identity. I think that kind of wraps us around the circle of why this podcast exists. I think writing this episode helped me understand something I had maybe never fully put into words before, and maybe hadn't really formed full thoughts on it. Maybe this is why WG started the Tri-State Time Machine in the first place. And I agree, because communities deserve to remember themselves. I think places deserve to be remembered for more than struggle. I think local stories matter. I think preserving history matters. I think communities like ours deserve to be seen as complicated, beautiful, flawed, resilient, evolving places, not stereotypes. So let's talk about the human comparison a little bit. You know, I kept thinking about something while writing all of this. Every single person listening right now has probably lived through a hard season. Maybe grief, maybe addiction touched your family, maybe it touched your life, maybe a financial struggle, a divorce, maybe trauma, maybe failure, loss. Now imagine someone meeting you and deciding that's all you were. Imagine the hardest chapter of your life becoming your identity forever. You would hate that. That would create its own trauma. You would want people to understand that there is more to you than your hardest season. So why would communities be any different? So I'm going to try to wrap this up the best that I can. Appalachia, it's not perfect. Huntington, it's not perfect. No community is. But I think one of the most unfair things we can do is reduce people, families, communities, entire regions down to stereotypes and headlines. Because the truth is, some of the strongest people I've ever known come from the places exactly like this. Some of the hardest working people I know came from communities exactly like this. Some of the most compassionate, creative, resourceful, resilient people I know were shaped by places exactly like this. And maybe that's the whole point. Places are complicated, communities are complicated, people are complicated. And no place deserves to be remembered only for its hardest chapter. So maybe next time somebody tries to tell a story about Appalachia or Huntington or communities like ours, maybe we make sure we are telling our own story first. And maybe that's exactly why local history matters more than people realize. That's why this podcast matters. Thank you for hanging out with me on this one. I know the episode was a little different and maybe a little heavier than normal. But honestly, I keep saying that, but I want people to really know I believe this in my heart. I think this may be one of my favorite conversations I've ever had here. I would genuinely love to hear what you think. What story shaped where you're from? And what do you wish more people understood about communities like ours? I love you guys. I love that you keep joining me. This has been the Tri-State Time Machine with Vanessa. And we're out of here.
Thanks for listening to the Tri-State Time Machine. If you have a memory you want Vanessa to talk more about, just send her an email at tstm@mail.com or post a comment on the Tri-State Time Machine Facebook page. Did you like the episode? Be sure to share it with friends and family. It's the only way we can continue this fun work that we do. You can find a link in the show notes that you can use to share it.